Apart from Beyonce holding the game in her hands on camera, the other best promo material for the Rhythm Heaven series was in Japan during the summer of 2008, when the Nice Girl Project Collective, headed by the J-pop idol groups Canary Club and The Possible, held a live concert to celebrate the launch of Rhythm Tengoku sequel on the Nintendo DS, called Rhythm Tengoku Gold. Now, as a Westerner, looking in, I remember stumbling across these clips on the early internet as a fan of its localization, Rhythm Heaven, the debut of the series worldwide. And I remember how cool it was to hear, for the first time, the original Japanese cut of songs that I had once recognized with English vocals and translated lyrics. It was the first time I recognized any video game as one that originated distinctly from Japan. It was also the first time that I had truly understood that Rhythm Heaven was in fact one of the most serious collaborations between video games and the music industry that has ever been made. Because just look at this extravaganza and star power for just 3 songs from a handheld DS game. This wasn't a loose celebrity endorsement, but the actual performers of those original songs who were even featured as characters in the game hosting an event with as much spectacle and elaborate choreography as any one of their actual concerts or music videos. It isn't just glamour that sells it either. The highlight of this event to me is their interpretation of the song from the fan club minigame. You know, the one where you have to blend in as a monkey in a sea of monkeys chanting for a human on stage. Wacky stuff, I know. Well, anyways, this actually happened in real life. The most interesting part of this live performance is that before actually starting, the group does a bit of a tutorial for the crowd on how they're supposed to clap and jump to the lyrics that the lead vocalist sings, just like the game. And when the show goes on, it practically feels like that game from Rhythm Heaven has seemingly come to life on stage. It's a pretty adorable moment that to me perfectly encapsulates the mission statement at large of the creator of pretty much everything you're seeing on screen right now, named Tsunku. The most important thing to recognize about Tsunku isn't just that he's a part of the Japanese music industry, but that he wanted to make good music in the Japanese music industry. When starting up his first band in the 90s, Sharon Q, he had always pushed to be more involved in the lyrics and music process for the best chance to gain hits and maintain record deals. When working with idol groups, a collective of musicians commonly known for frontlining the image and fashion of the singers before their actual music, Tsunku had continually stressed how important it was for him that the quality and sound of what idols were performing to was, and should always be, the top priority. And of course, the big reason why he approached Nintendo to make a music-themed video game wasn't just so he could extend his creativity further, but specifically because he felt that audiences did not take the concept of rhythm seriously, paired with the fact that he felt dissatisfied in how most music video games were treating this side of the gameplay. And he wanted that to change, so much so that the moment he was able to wrangle up a team of developers to work on the first Rhythm Tengoku, he effectively put them into dancing lessons before doing any serious work on the game. That's how much he cared about wanting every facet of the project, from the creation to the experience, to be about improving your relationship with rhythm. The result was a pair of handheld games where, for once in this genre, you weren't meant to be some miraculous musical prophet who was destined to handle the millions of notes on screen. You were instead humbled into learning how to be a good backup that can work together with your ensemble, support the body of the music and the choreography, and sustain an excellent performance. And all of that gets beautifully recreated in this live concert. I highly recommend sitting down to just enjoy this clip on your own time. It always opens my eyes towards the true behind-the-scenes quality of Rhythm Heaven as a series. That said, there was also something pretty revealing and prophetic about this clip at the time, and by extension, the prestige of the series. After all, what makes it such an interesting event is that it was this large-scale, highly rehearsed concert with lights, glitter, multiple focal points, and perky performers bussing across the stage to a huge crowd attendance for a series of games on handhelds that, in contrast, prided themselves in training rhythm from a private perspective. Games that felt more like peeking into an intimate concert than actually attending one. A one-on-one rhythm trainer, something meant to be played by everyone, but not meant to be played with everyone. I mean, Lord knows I've tried as a kid to shove my sideways DS into my friends' faces at the time, and also being a YouTuber. But with so much quality going into the sound, the game design, and even the animation of these games, with how much stranger these sorts of rhythms that players were already being exposed to by the second game. And this star-crossed moment, you get to see it pop out of a smaller screen, you couldn't help but wonder at the time what it would be like if Rhythm Heaven didn't just get a new entry, but was home to a bigger stage. And so, in 2011 in Japan and a year later internationally, Rhythm Heaven would receive its console debut on the Nintendo Wii, and thus sees that hint of potential. And I think it's worth pointing out its unique subtitles as a sequel. Of course, there was Korea's method of putting the word "we" in front of the original name. There's the always jaunty "beat the beat" rhythm paradise of Europe. They sure were trying to sell us a rhythm-based video game with that one. But us in North America commonly know this game as Rhythm Heaven Fever, while in Japan it originated as Mina no Rhythm Tengoku, also known as Everyone's Rhythm Tengoku. And I think there's something pretty salient about those two names in particular. Sure, fever is a pretty stock buzzword for a sequel. You could slap the word fever on pretty much any eccentric take or moment in a video game. And yeah, naming something as an everyone game, especially on the Wii, could give the vibe of a chaotic, party-based multiplayer take on the series. But trust me, it goes a bit deeper than that. 6 years into making Rhythm Heaven games and finally landing on a platform that would give the chance to design games for a television audience, encourage the initiative to get crazier and wilder and weirder than anything the series has done before. And it wasn't going to be presented in a format made for your eyes only. It was now meant to be viewed on a standard display, designed to be spectacular, spectated, and scrutinized. Fever is the concert edition of Rhythm Heaven. It's Rhythm Heaven gone wild, and now everybody's staring. The big staples of this new entry are that challenge and visual spectacle are given the headliner treatment in the core Rhythm Heaven gameplay, and not just in pieces or phases. Take a look at the opening moments of Fever compared to previous games, with this being an adaptation of the classic rhythm test from Tengoku on Game Boy Advance. But what started as a simple printing minigame with a few audio curveballs and what follows up the previous tutorial on how to use the device to play the video game properly, now becomes the same game from the first, but as this sort of ultra-precise X-ray monitor board meeting of your rhythm, which transitions into this sort of comedy routine where the hosts block your view of the screen and force you to do this bit semi-blind. Then what about the opening minigame? Well, we go from punching things as a karate man to a simple beat, to building doodads in a factory on an easy do-re-mi rhythm, to a golfer being pitched golf balls by a monkey and a giant mandrill that underhands you with heavy fastballs unforeseeable to the human eye and with a trickier cue than the monkey to land consecutive hole-in-ones at an island in the distance. Cue the waterworks and the rainbow at the end. Now, Fever doesn't entirely shy away from more intimate or intuitive minigames like ones you would find in the previous games. It's just that for every game like that, there are probably 3 others that force you to cope with some crazed, multi-layered concept. What's that? You had fun with your one-on-one tambourine session with a monkey on a blue backdrop? Well, why don't you try controlling an entire monkey watch where you have to clap every individual monkey on a 2-beat measure with some pink monkeys in a mix that you gotta go even further backbeat to clap, then we'll zoom the screen out for a sec, and then throw this monkey on a hot air balloon that gets in the way of what you're doing. And then we'll make a more insane version of that simple Simon Says game, where you gotta toss as many clay balls as your stage partner chooses to throw at you, even when they're at the strangest part of the beat possible. You don't want to fail just as the giant ship glaring at you in the background is about to lift off, right? You liked being a fake DJ or an easy breezy beatboxer? Well, it's time to be a backup feature that's trained to rap on cue 5 different ways. You liked being in a group of 6 cheerleaders? Well, let's add 6 more. You liked punching stuff as Karate Joe in a smooth R&B breakup jam? Well, now prepare to bawl your eyes out while doing combos at a faster tempo and as a guitar shreds in the background. Counting down 4 different rockets, where 3 of them are actually the same beat, but with mixed up countdowns as a tease? Yeah, that is pretty tough with all the stars and stuff, buddy, but at least we gave you some numbering to help you out. Now anyway, next we want you to pilot this unstable rocket thing by switching up between 2 different rhythms when we tell you, then play one half of a bossa nova beat and switch up yet again to the other unique half when we tell you. What's that? You don't know what a bossa nova beat is? Well, you're sure gonna have to know it now to clear this game. But don't worry, you'll get to the beach side to cool off soon, where you'll meet a quartet of shrimp shuffling to a weirdly specific 6-beat pattern, which, by the way, we're gonna ask you to switch up on cue again. Oh, and you should also know what to do when hearing the first 3 letters of the alphabet. What, were you expecting more? I mean, we can give you more if you'd like. Fever's campaign is like Rhythm Cram University, or being on tour where you're part of over 30 different acts. You're almost always costume changing from one insane musical number to the next, where a technical hiccup is almost always guaranteed to occur on each stage, and yet you manage to keep the show going on every time anyway. The individual premises behind the minigames are also just outrageous. Acrobatics on a seesaw that air guitar and explode from how awesome they are, going on a date with a girl while also trying to kick away balls that could threaten to harm the gophers who are also on a date, and whom your crush is getting distracted by. She's so layered. One of my personal favorites is Figure Fighter, a tiny guy punching a bag, but the twist is that all he needs is a split second when the button is pressed to become buff and knock things down in an instant. It's like a rhythmic version of the 1-inch punch or something. This is very much the kind of character that could only make sense in a video game. There's even a point where the English localization kinda gives up and goes, yeah, your guess is as good as mine as to what the hell these mad lads came up with here. As a standalone rhythm game, it's hard not to admire what's on display here. To this day, I've yet to play a music game or any video game that has explored the depths of rhythm theory as thoroughly, that has challenged me as much to engage with the game on an audible and theatrical level, and one that sounds this good and looks this clean. Now would be a good time to bring up that the footage you're seeing here is the game being played on the Dolphin emulator, which was mostly done for convenience, but also to show that, upscaled or otherwise, the art style holds up tremendously. We've gone from pixelated conversions of thick outline characters to just having thick outline characters on screen, and it's wonderful. You could even go as far as to say that Fever is Tsunku's loudest approach to the Rhythm Heaven origin so far. Sharper cues, more confusion, and thus more need for mastery, more content, more fluid animation, more vocal tracks. If there's any entry in this series that wants to jam into your ear, the idea that being good at rhythm is something you have to earn and not something that will always be served to you on a platter shaped like a 300 score, it would have to be Rhythm Heaven Fever. But that also, to me, raises the biggest question I want to ask and explore about Fever. The good old diminishing returns talk, which is me basically asking, how does this change Rhythm Heaven? Because Fever didn't just exist in a vacuum as the totalization of exactly what Rhythm Heaven was meant to be and restrained itself from being on handhelds, and what Tsunku wanted from the very beginning when collaborating with Nintendo to make a game. It exists as this cathartic third iteration of a series that, much like how it wanted to teach rhythm to others, had to humble itself to be designed for a handheld, and thus adapt its attitude of how it wanted to get players to engage with rhythm before getting the stage treatment it probably wanted or felt it deserved. You may want to bake the biggest strawberry wedding cake in the world, but what are you gonna do when all you got is a bowl of hand-picked strawberries that make your friends and family happy? And what's gonna be left behind once you finally reach that stage in life when you can bake that strawberry cake? Just like how turning a DS game into a concert is a massive ordeal, so too is turning a private and humble rhythm game into a feverish event for everyone. Which, is not me immediately snubbing my nose at the idea, because of course there are plenty of successes with turning Rhythm Heaven into a console game. Giving it a televised presence, you put a greater priority on its audio-visual design. And these are enhancements that remain emblematic to the trademarks of the series on handhelds, namely that being good at rhythm isn't something calculated, but something you witness, hear, and participate in as an ordinary slice of life. Sounds are much sharper and percussive, with a greater emphasis on voice chants and backup calls, human or otherwise. Heaven on DS did a really good job at embodying its cues with lyrical catchphrases or jingles, things that can get stuck in your head, and thus you know instinctively what to do when you hear them ring.
Sweet little girl, just don't you look behind you now. Just keep on dancing all night. Hey, come on.
And Fever doubles down on that with some of the best earworms in the series. Different monkeys telling you to hit different types of golf balls, knowing how to stop spinning on cue once you hear your secretary go 1, 2, 3. I could literally just go bum 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 or bum 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 bum, two eerily similar cues in this game, and yet you'd know exactly what the difference is between them and what to do about both of them. The most viral one in Fever is probably the ringside interview, right? There are 3 different ways for this hulking wrestling man to respond to a question, and all he has to say is, pose, or pose even more. So now more than ever, and being designed for output across the room from an external speaker on a TV set or something, you're further encouraged to not just match the cues correctly, but to associate the cues and the overall challenge of the game to a friendly face that's depending on you to win the game cooperatively, and thus one you gotta strive to put your own weight into. Your friend on the other side of the seesaw, what I assume to be your boss, micromanaging you to double up your workload off screen. Even something like an enemy demon taunting you with their incoming attack. You promptly respond to a friendly call or a demanding roll call. Not in a way that's too late to care if you're slightly offbeat or too eager to get your words in first, but at the perfect intended time to show that you do genuinely care about affirming you and your team's role in the overall show. A greater focus on vocal sound design also comes with the most vocal songs in a Rhythm Heaven game yet, specifically in the remixes. So the typical layer of having to cooperate with your immediate rhythm squad is met with another layer of having to complement this other distant singer doing their thing. A voice that you're not obliged to directly respond to, or even one that's necessarily calling to you specifically to do a cue, but one that you do have to back up and work together with, even if they have their own unique routine to pull the weight of. soundtracks were some of the coolest exceptions in the handheld games for these reasons, making the game come full circle as a playable music video. And Fever makes it much more of a prominent feature in the setlist and a mindset for the games as a whole, to make each game feel like a vocal or more percussive jam session, which is great. Fever once again features that classic animation quirk of the series, where your player character only moves to your input specifically, even if they are correct but slightly off from the rest of the crowd or the intended flow of animations. This was already an excellent way to both prove that this was your gameplay on screen, but also a clever way to build a rapport with your skill at the game from an animation standpoint, to amicably determine from animation alone how well you're playing, or how close you are to becoming out of line. So just imagine how much more aware of it you are now that these characters are made for the big screen. Larger and smoother animations from the sexiest of poses to the most subtle of nudges, paired with a more acute approach to sound design, exposes more than ever that you're the one in control of what's on screen, and this is your sense of rhythm being mixed into the current track. And while these were qualities that had existed since the first Rhythm Heaven game, something I'll admit looking back at my coverage of those handheld games is that I didn't catch on to those qualities before I initially reviewed those games. And the main reasons I learned how influential they are to the experience are that A, I was inclined to do a project where I had to sit down and thoroughly analyze hours of footage of them, and B, when I got the chance to capture high-resolution footage of these otherwise tiny screen video games. And upon playback, it all became clear to me, especially the razor sharpness of the player sprite animations. It's something so subtle on an LCD viewfinder, but something so obvious when displayed on a monitor. And whether it was intended or otherwise, this is the byproduct of converting Rhythm Heaven into a console game. When designing a game that's going to be broadcasted in front of a room and not just one pair of hyper-fixated eyes, even in single player, the focal points and the subtleties of the game's cast are gonna stick out to you more and are gonna make your contributions that much more important to what's going on. It also helps to be a YouTube gamer covering these games, because even if someone were to snag this clean logoless footage for all I care, that gameplay is always going to be embedded one way or another with my sense of rhythm. Ah, look at that, Ma, there's me nailing that one tricky tap true part in the remix. You saw me there, right? I know you did. I also think this quirk fits perfectly with the everyone element of this new installment. Yes, there are multiplayer games and modes in Fever, but a big part of directing a Rhythm Heaven game for the TV is that anyone in view of said screen can get a glimpse of your gameplay, and thus a third-person point of view while you're on the hot seat. With the minigames feeling more staged and composed of multiple parts and pieces on screen, you not only get a lot of smooth and flashy effects on the focal points, but also a lot of background detail occurring as a result of your rhythm. Something not really made to complement the beat of the game, as much as it is a fun circumstance that a bystander can easily notice and find their own amusement out of as you're dead set concentrated. Then you see the playback for yourself and you go, did that really happen while I was in the zone? On that note, I kinda wanna point out how it dawned on me while writing for this video that Rhythm Heaven Fever is genuinely a pretty funny game. And not like funny weird, like look how weird it is to tap dance with animals kind of funny, but actual gags that are made at your expense. Yeah, something's telling me that visual markers do impede my rhythm development. But this is what I feel is the ultimate test in Rhythm Heaven Fever, beyond playing well casually and for perfects. Can you keep a beat when there's someone watching you? Someone that you're more than likely aiming to impress by sharing them your screen, or someone who's waiting for the moment that you mess up the game so they have an easy pass to poke fun at you. If you're the one concentrating on getting the audio cues correct, then they'll be the ones who'll notice the consistency of your player sprite. Maybe you'll even have to deal with their random commentary or reactions as you're trying to find and maintain the beat. Or maybe you'll be the one giving commentary or audible noises as you're playing the game, to prove your dedication to the sport, or just to make the game night feel more like a conversational jam session. Or maybe you ask people to shut up while you're gaming. Could be one of those. I don't normally tune into streams or let's plays of music games, nor do I personally stream or show them off to my friends very often. But Rhythm Heaven Fever is the best exception. It's a blast to watch both newbies and veterans to the game react in different ways, whether they get confused by some weird-ass cue or put a self-imposed handicap on themselves like a blindfold while playing, because pretty much any way you stream or record this game is always going to have the pressure of a live audience watching you up to the moment you finish a game or fail. Even for someone like me, primarily focusing this video on the single-player campaign of Fever, I'll admit that when recording the footage you're seeing now, where it was just me and the game in the same room, I always had this nagging feeling in the back of my head that people are gonna watch this and wait for the moments when my character sticks out like a sore thumb. More than any other entry before, and even when casually playing Fever outside of video purposes, I do get legitimate stage fright when playing this game, which is both awesome and terrifying. I think it's because of how embarrassing getting something wrong in this game looks. I'm getting too comfy when I feel like I've memorized everything about these longer minigames. Then it only takes one blank in-ear presence of mind, leading to a single screw-up to wake me up completely, or fill me with this sense of dread over how bad that moment looked on screen. But on the flip side, there is something really fulfilling about mustering up some confidence and overcoming that fear of playing something much more taxing and much more prone to criticism, only to completely nail it on video. This is what makes the perfect campaign here the most grueling, but also the most rewarding of the current trilogy. With that said, I'd like to pivot to what I think is the biggest game changer to Rhythm Heaven here, the priority on challenge. Not just evident from the increased amount of rules and variety of the games here, but especially in the choice of control scheme, which is the one thing about Fever that isn't so loud. So how do you play this Rhythm Heaven Wii game that released in 2011? Well, you hold the Wii remote in front of you, you press the A button, and you sometimes press it together with the B button, and that's it. That's all the controls for Rhythm Heaven Fever. Wow. Now, plenty of major releases on the Wii at this time were already moving on from requiring motion to just using traditional control schemes without a care. But Rhythm Heaven Fever is a strikingly one-button rhythm game. With a secondary input occasionally, yes, but realistically, 16 out of the 28 new original minigames here are mainly controlled with the A button. There's maybe one minigame that does purely involve using both buttons together, which might as well be a single input, while the ones that feature both functions independently mostly focus on the A button. What a pretty stunning streamline of events, especially when you compare it to all the trial and error put into making Rhythm Heaven work on the DS. In fact, if you read the Iwata Asks interview with the Rhythm Heaven team, you'd see that they did try to make a prototype of Fever with motion controls, but ran into a technical wall of trying to make it work with their game until they just gave up and tried to convince Nintendo that they could make a Rhythm Heaven game with just buttons. To which they completely agreed straight up. Like, why not just make a new Rhythm Heaven game with buttons? With that said, I think it's more appropriate to call Fever a successor to Tengoku on GBA. In fact, there are a lot more connections and evolutions of concepts from that specific entry compared to DS. It shares similar minigames, ones that feel like they could be staged like a Tengoku entry. There are plenty of callbacks and references to the cast of Tengoku. There are straight up remastered ports of Tengoku minigames as a post-game bonus. But more importantly, the series has returned to its roots by being about timing button presses, which makes sense considering that Tengoku and the mode of playing Rhythm Heaven with buttons had yet to make full-blown appearances internationally. And also, no matter how hard you try to convince the masses of the potential of training your rhythm in things like touchscreen gestures or theoretical motion waggling, the fact of the matter is that tapping a button in time is the heart of every single video game and the heart of keeping rhythm with an instrument. There's no other function in this world that will get you closer to keeping the beat, let alone beating the beat, than something you can percussively hit and get an instant reaction out of. But while this scheme takes inspiration from Tengoku, it also has a very different set of priorities, now that Rhythm Heaven has become all about a big fat A button. You know, the one with the A on it. So if you're not making a gyro metronome out of your Wii Remote when playing Fever, then what you are doing is using the lightweight ergonomics of the controller's shape to personally command a single input. In concept, this is pretty liberating. You have a tight grip on the remote without having to stress your hand to form any sort of uncomfortable figure, meaning that you can play the game pretty flexibly between more determined stances where you want the controller and the button in front of you, and more relaxed positions where you lay your hand down on your lap or your side and just let the game flow as you control it offhand. The best thing about using the Wii Remote for this game is the new pinch technique that Fever introduces. Pushing down the A and B buttons on opposite ends of the Wii Remote has a perfect feel of pressure and release. Again, I don't think it's that central to the game compared to the A button purely, and it's certainly not as prominent as the flicking motion of Rhythm Heaven on DS, but when it does come into play, it makes for some pretty powerful secondary cues than what a simple button press could express alone. Now would probably be another good time to mention that the footage for this video was recorded with two different versions of the game. The North American Rhythm Heaven Fever, and Europe's Beat the Beat edition, just so I could take advantage of its exclusive dual audio setting, so I could comfortably showcase both the English and Japanese dubs for this game. To make my playthrough stick out though, I played the Beat the Beat edition with inputs mapped to a typical controller, while the Fever edition was played with a real Wii Remote. And while I could get through BTB perfectly fine with a face button and the right trigger to emulate the pinch, it was when I got to playing Fever on the Wii Remote as it intended, where I felt a mountain of difference. Maybe not functionally, but absolutely in how I behaved while playing the game. Stick anyone with a controller and tell them to time a button press just right, and you're not going to see much activity out of them. You could see them get a bit antsy, maybe fidgeting or tapping around the controller with their fingers before aiming for the button. But otherwise, they're kind of stuck on that grip of what is essentially a brick in their hands. But stick anyone with a Wii Remote and a copy of Fever, and what do you typically see them doing? Swinging the Wii Remote around in rhythm just as they're about to hit the button. So in that way, you could make the argument that motion still ends up being a crucial part of playing Rhythm Heaven Fever, even if it's not required mechanically. With that said, while the controller does fit pretty well for this game in the best cases, I do also think that it's the first sort of wall that I run into when trying to enjoy this game as an evolution of Rhythm Heaven. See, my favorite thing about the series on handhelds, aside from the liberty of playing it anywhere you go and that its mechanics were ultra precise in timing, was how it built this sort of progression around the controls that made pretty great use of either the classic two-face button and D-pad control scheme, or an entire touchscreen of possibilities. Sure, there were games that only controlled with a single button or tap, but not as many as you may think. In fact, both early entries were pretty good at expanding your control set from the start to the end of the campaign, giving you not just a better relationship with rhythm concepts, but also the device you were holding, where by the end, you were effectively treating it like an instrument, with multiple features that you could press down and get other techniques out of. And if we're revisiting our instrument comparison with the Rhythm Heaven series in mind, if Tengoku on GBA was like a mini drum kit or keyboard where you gotta punch the keys, and if Heaven on DS was something closer to a string instrument with finger gestures, then I would say that Fever on Wii goes for something a bit more sophisticated than the norm. The baton of a conductor. Not exactly a musical instrument that outputs any sound of its own, but conceptually, a baton is a communication tool for how the performance should go in the mix of an overwhelming group and environment. Yes, it can be assumed that every musician or performer you see on stage should be rhythmically and melodically trained on their own, but the baton as an extension of the conductor and thus the band is there as the centerpiece that concurs how prepared everything truly is, to express when and what parts of physical performance needs a stronger emphasis, and to hold together performers when they run the risk of straying out of line with the room. Even when the musical pieces don't need a metal stick or a guy in the middle to help them, any small but timely gesture helps in adding to the body of performance, and conductors can be the emblem to the audience that their ensemble is under control and all synchronized, a tool that effectively communicates the strength of one's relationship with a team and their rhythm. And this is why I think people tend to move when playing Fever, even when you're playing it alone. The Wii Remote is such an unobtrusive part of the gameplay, but also the perfect extension of you being the one in control of a musical. It essentially unlocks the rest of your body and voice to feel out the game in front of you. When constrained to a handheld gadget, you maybe had the room to tap your feet on the floor or nod your head to the beat, but here you can clap along or swing with feeling to guide you, or if you're in a group showing this game off, you might count down your gestures with words or do everything you say to the beat, or make noises from your mouth to get some vocal signature out of the game. These are all things that you're free to do in Fever, and the point of this game being on the Wii Remote is to give you a better medium to express yourself. But on the other hand, that is also what I think is ultimately the biggest draw with the series here. Tengoku and Heaven on DS let you be in the shoes of the performer on screen, but Fever on Wii lets you manage performers as an off-screen presence, which is what I think incentivizes Fever's challenge to focus less on the progression of the controls or the player characters, and now becomes principally on the amount of cues and the memorization of said cues, now that the step of the learning curve where you have to figure out what controls what is seemingly swept under the rug for the most part. It's all about timing now. Know when to press the A button when the game says this or that, and do it a lot of times. And maybe sometimes you gotta pinch A with some other button for when the game asks for anything different. And while it is pretty impressive to get this much mileage out of a single button game, it does also mean that it takes pretty damn quickly in the campaign for the controls to be pushed to their limit. One thing I will say is that timing the A button on the Wii Remote fits best for games that involve good isolated hits, where you have enough wiggle room to kind of feel out the beat and then direct all of that energy to a well-timed press. It feels good. This is why Ringside is more than just a funny bit, but a really fun game to play with Fever's control scheme. It's like a good comedy duo routine. You wait for the straight man to talk, then you come in with the punchline that knocks everyone's socks off. I also feel similarly towards games like Exhibition Match and Forklifter, which are also games that ask you to play with patience and swing an inputs just right. These are games that could have come straight out of the early entries, games that are less about memorization, but more about the pressure of nailing a single action at the perfect moment. On that note, I also want to say that I genuinely think Fever has a perfect opening set of minigames. Hole-in-One, like I brought up earlier, is a step up in wackiness, but no less inviting and magical in execution, amping up its challenge just enough that you can keep a comfy steadiness. It's also the one game I think of in the set that brings out the best of the sort of miraculous quality of the A button that they were trying to go for with this game. That despite all this craziness you're about to face, some of which even defy our natural reality, all it takes is good rhythm with a single button to make anything possible. And seeing consecutive hole-in-ones in the distance is a beautiful way to paint that idea. Screwbot Factory is a direct lift from the literal third minigame from the DS entry, but that does mean it shares its control qualities, and it is the one game in Fever that I think does something interesting with the pinch, playing with the tension of holding it and the correct time to release it, which is actually a rare occasion in the package. I also really love the science behind Seesaw. Every game in Fever can technically be played with audio alone, but this is one that does a good job examining how characters in certain formations causes certain rhythms to unfold. Very cool. And nothing gives me that uki uki waku waku feeling more than Double Date. I already brought up how bizarrely layered the scenario is, but at the end of the day, it's a romantic slow jam, and a prime example of how good this series is, and not just making characters that look cool and quirky, but creating cute and intimate moments and dynamics about them. I almost always get a cozy feeling from getting to this point in the game. The remix of this set is also fantastic, and where you get a good impression of Fever's ability to make way more comprehensive remixes, thematically and challenge-wise. There are some minigames here that get an amp up in tempo than their usual stride. And I love the island honeymoon theme, how all of these characters are serenading this will they, won't they couple, while throwing golf balls their way. I almost never hesitate to start a playthrough of Fever because of how excellent and varied that initial set is. Which is to say that Fever starts to get demanding pretty quickly after this point, and nestles itself into a pretty standard meta of complexity, both mechanically and even creatively, and midway, I find myself getting pretty burnt out. Not to say that any of these games are particularly awful, and that there aren't highlights. In fact, my favorite game in Fever is right in the third set. Air Rally is the most exhilarating premise of any game in the series. Playing a steady set of badminton while facing the vertigo of being high up in the sky on planes, and of course all the weather and shit getting in your face. I especially like the difficulty modifier of this minigame, where your partner flies farther away, but the beat still remains the same, which isn't a difference mechanically, but a difference in how you perceive his calls, with an added Doppler effect sonically, and how you must persist with a dedicated sense of rhythm, come rain or shine, or regardless of how far your friend may be. It's a fine challenge audibly, but a complete visual marvel in action. When the game constrains its difficulty and lets the presentation speak for the charm, it's a great time. But sadly, I'd say that you don't get anything that iterates on how promising and well-balanced that initial set of minigames was moving forward. Not that many games that use the pinch technique creatively, besides hitting something that isn't the A button, a deluge of games about keeping a steady row of button taps and memorizing a bunch of stuff in a routine, and to be honest, a set of premises that just doesn't have that same sentimental or personal appeal that I loved more in minigames from the previous entries. I enjoy the first 3 games of the Remix 2 set, and while I find Monkey Watch to be really cute, I can't deny it's a pretty sharp difficulty spike that feels way out of base than its sister minigames. I also think games like Working Dough and the culminating Build-to-Scale that combines mechanics from Tengoku and Heaven DS's Build-to-Scales are pretty cool, but also add on to that kinda overwhelming and quirky meta that I think the game starts to get too comfy with doing. It looks cool and the challenge is fun, but that's about as far as I go with them. good challenges and weird but fun moments. Mechanically and creatively, the minigames iterate and do have some awesome exceptions, but without much of a diversion for the controls or the type of scenario as you go. You're always featuring in some sensational event where even the music, while exceptionally produced as usual, always feels like it's at a high upbeat tempo. It has to be upbeat all the time, which I think the previous games did a better job at mixing up, adding slower jams and a range of both wacky, upbeat, kick-ass, and even sad premises. But I think my biggest woe here is the lack of a progression when it comes to control mechanics. The previous games didn't always focus its challenge on how many times you can keep doing the one thing it tasks you to do. It instead encouraged you to engage with the performers on screen, with their assigned roles and technical potential as a performer. Pressing the D-pad in certain directions to do the proper move in the space dance, riffing and pausing at the right times with the touchscreen like the strings of a guitar, using the D-pad in tandem with the A button to achieve multi-tap cues, which is the one area that the Wii Remote in Fever definitely struggles in the most, specifically in games like Flockstep and Flipper Flop. Again, I think they're cute, I like the challenge, but man, your thumb gets pretty sore when going through these. And I don't know about you guys, but I start to feel a bit of separation anxiety with my other hand, just kind of wishing it could be there for my dominant gamer hand to lend some of these hits. So I end up in this kind of pathetic position where I hold the Wii Remote vertically with both hands, which is my picturesque way of saying, as a game critic, yeah, I really do wish they considered a multi-button control scheme here. That way, if you really did want to make a Rhythm Heaven game about more obtuse cues and rhythm concepts, you could divvy up the complexity. You could support and create a neat progression of the game mechanically and functionally, getting back to that instrumental quality from the handhelds. Honk honk. And then you could have the freedom to play with rhythmic premises and ideas that aren't just off the handle, crazy, and constantly at a high tempo. No stress to assign all of that madness to one input. It just really makes me think about where this series started, because when the team was tasked to make Rhythm Heaven a reality on handhelds, and Nintendo ones of all things, it was a big hurdle to overcome. Before even thinking logistically about teaching audiences to engage with rhythm seriously, especially on the DS, they first had to consider how people were playing these games, how people were treating video game buttons, what kind of games were appearing on these devices, and if a unique gimmick was even scientifically possible with rhythm. But I think it was that creative strife that led them to really consider the intimacy and lasting power of what they were making. Alternate controls meant another side you get to see of a character that communicates to their peers in a unique way. It created this kind of language and culture of its own through the medium of video games. And look, I'd like to sit here and be the gamer that tells you that challenge is the core of every game. It was exactly what the series needed when it came to Fever. Getting bombarded with cues and not liking it is cause you're lame and you don't appreciate having a good sense of rhythm. Touch controls are for softies, you either go hard or don't go to heaven, you know what I'm saying? But I also don't like lying to you, and I'm not cool enough to deny that a game like Rhythm Heaven on DS is still not just one of the most miraculous pieces of software I've ever played, but also one where I cherish so many scenarios of it like a fond memory, regardless of difficulty or how many things they ask me to do in their tutorials. Talking to your Moai husband or lizard lover, being a fake DJ, but at the end of the day, being a fake DJ with someone as likable as DJ Yellow by your side. There's a reason why the fan club minigame was the one that got the concert treatment and that special segment teaching people how to act it out in real life, and why Heaven on DS was so well-rounded that it could convert one of its minigames into a full-blown endless arcade game, another of its minigames into a full-length version for a remix, and another of its minigames into a loving post-game send-off. And while we're reminiscing here, I do want to put some fresh retrospect on one of the claims I made in my previous stylish retrospect of Rhythm Tengoku at the time. I'll come clean and say that it was pretty short-sighted of me to dismiss the more experimental minigames in that entry as things that were holding back the game's creativity or potential, when some of those games do have the multi-button design that I want more out of this series. I said in the past that there was nothing interesting about seeing blocks and cylinders or fireworks or the like in Rhythm, but now I think that's pretty dumb of me to say, because the appeal is that they're in Rhythm, that these are everyday occurrences like dancing, factory work, or drawing that do have legitimate rhythm metas when doing them in real life, and are thus given a much needed lens of introspection with their minigame interpretation in Tengoku. Ultimately, I still stand by the opinion that I like when the series goes into more personified concepts for minigames, but I've made peace with this side of the game. That the idea for the creativity of this side is that it wanted to let the reality of Rhythm speak for itself in a kinda cool, gamey, tech demo sort of way. And again, it's another avenue that makes you think more of what kind of techniques you can do with rhythm in a video game, and not just what madhouse concept you can ask the player to do in an effort to get them to learn. I want to stress that I don't think either of these games are flawless or peaking in potential when it comes to controls. There's certainly room to improve and iterate and expand, especially with Tengoku's traditional scheme. But unfortunately, that's not really something that gets tackled with Fever, isn't it? The most it gets is the pinch, but even this is an easier and less prominent sub of the flick. The latter being a move that signaled how the game of its respective entry was about so much more that you could do with the touchscreen, and how much more personal control you had over a potential cue. Winding up a flick reflected your character readying themselves for the big moment, even if it wasn't supposed to be in rhythm. But the pinch move for this entry is a bigger timed hit, just like the timed hit you usually do, here to signal a game primarily about routine difficulty. Fever, in many ways, feels a lot closer to other music video games in the market that this series used to try to stand taller than. Games that are more focused on perfectionist memorization, or how you handle the pressure of a bunch of musical things happening at once. Yeah, it kinda risks crossing that line, even with its original format intact. But I want to accompany that hot take with the biggest asterisk in the world, which is that I enjoy other music games, and I enjoy Rhythm Heaven Fever like how I enjoy most other music games. Actually, having that Rhythm Heaven DNA does make it a bit tighter and smarter designed than your average music game, so that helps. A lot of mini-games and even remixes of this entry are talked about in infamy, and I even remember as a kid getting stuck on more parts of this campaign than the one in Heaven on DS. But unlike previous games, where some of the trickiest parts of the game were a result of bad sequencing or a lack of intuition, pretty much everything in Fever feels fair game. There's maybe one or two moments that I'd stretch to call BS on. Even if the games are loaded with instructions and actions, it's all relatively fine to catch on to. Again, my big problem with Fever is the overabundance on difficulty as a crutch to the game's design, and not so much the difficulty of the games, because even the hardest parts of Fever is like saying this optional lecture is helping me too much for the exam that's about to happen in a few minutes, which is to say that they're totally doable if you try hard enough, and pretty fun when you crack their code. And there are moments where this sort of sink or swim approach to teaching rhythms does tickle my fancy than what the handheld games offer. I've found myself really growing to love Bossa Nova, for example. It's one of the more inexplicable games in the set about following a peculiar rhythm and not so much timing a response to a cue, but learning that beat is cool, the music is relaxing, but it's paired with a good challenge, and being the master of both sides of the turntable is pretty enjoyable. It's like Lockstep if it were chill as heck. Another game I want to highlight is Tap Troop. This is the kind of game that's bound to confuse every newcomer and even mystify oldies until that magic moment in their lives where they suddenly realize what it was trying to go for. The best way I can put it here is that you're basically dimension hopping from one steady rhythm to a more unique one, where there isn't always an easy transition from one to the other, and you just gotta use your smarts to find the best place to get back to that prime timeline.
Bum, bum, tap, tap, ready, and bum, 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 tap, tap, tap.
Yeah, that makes sense, right? Overall, I don't think Fever was able to elicit a lot of the same emotions and potential of the previous entries, with a handful of exceptions where I genuinely love what's going on. And I think the biggest sign to me that something had changed with the Rhythm Heaven I knew going into Fever was rummaging through the reading material I earned and mostly going, huh, that's pretty weird, but kinda cool. Fever does have some great inter-series moments that make some fun connections to a cool, larger universe, especially with Tengoku, an entry that even up to now is mostly foreign to a lot of people. It's cool to have a series so passionate about its legacy that it's even willing to bring up games you've probably never heard of and will probably never play. However, I felt a bit disappointed that there wasn't too much depth or pathos to sink into with the individual premises of the games, which probably wouldn't have worked out anyway, considering how preoccupied these games are with being off the wall. You don't get heartwarming backstories like one of the retired members of the Clappy Trio helping out some choir kids with their rhythm, or a girl attending a lab and third-wheeling a dude in a bear suit just to get closer to her crush. A lot of the readings here are just amusing conversations and details about the gameplay of these games that kinda already speak for themselves, which is fine, but ultimately kinda underwhelming that Fever toned down some of the neat storytelling edge that minigames used to be really good at doing. This is just another example of the kinda one-sided love I have for this game. I love talking about the concepts and challenges of these games, but I kinda wish I could go into spiels about the strife or lore about them, as I could for pretty much any game in something like Heaven on DS, and even chunks of Tengoku. But I think even if Fever doesn't live up too much to the standards and potential that I personally want from a new Rhythm Heaven game, I can at least attest that its best unique quality is that the rhythms and creativity it does exhibit are extremely fascinating, and that its challenge, while overwhelming to sit through at times, does have a rewarding feel to completing it all. And I probably would never encounter anything like the rhythms of this game in my day-to-day life had I not been confronted by aliens and monkeys and the likes to do so. I guess to put things into perspective, let's get into endgame content. Fever has the same sequel phase after completing all the original minigames, but it ends up feeling a lot different this time around. Because, again, this is Rhythm Heaven Fever, a game whose base difficulty and creativity is already about overwhelming the player. So here it mostly feels like a formality. There are most certainly some standout sequels here, thematically and challenge-wise. I love the continuation of Samurai Slice as this wandering, time-traveling warrior helping commoners with random knickknacks fighting off the forces of evil, this time in a sick costume. The cheerleaders moving on from a library to a museum is a neat progression, and I actually really love the production and intensity of Love Rap 2. This phase is home to some of the best remixes in the series as well. But I will admit that every time I reach this point, I mostly feel like I'm getting more Fever content, and not like I'm entering some lion's den of a difficulty here, which was a feeling that was pretty prevalent with the more recreational campaigns like the ones in Tengoku and Heaven on DS. The sequels in those games really didn't hold back in pushing your understanding of a straightforward and vibey starting minigame. I also theorized that some of the games that felt cut short in those base campaigns were intentionally done to give them a better spotlight in the sequel phase. But most of Fever is already jam-packed with complete and challenging minigames, and here it feels like you get more of that, which mostly boils down to being pretty good. That may sound like a backhanded compliment, but again, I do like the challenge of Fever. The forte of the sequel is more demanding action, so these minigame sequels feel right at home with what you were already doing. And while I may have had my ups and downs with certain phases of the campaign, it's all worth it to get to Remix 10, right? There are a lot of reasons why this section precedes the game's own reputation, and not just for reasons that would get this video flagged. It's a fast-tempo culmination of the largest and most demanding set of minigames in the series yet, with almost everyone having a handful of cues that you had to memorize along the way. So more than ever, you're gonna get called at and cued and signaled to do some uniquely specific thing at every few seconds of this remix. You're always kept guessing how the tone and mood are gonna swerve. And to add the double cherries on top are the random cameo of the tutorial section of Fever, but not just the tutorial section, but the moment in the tutorial section that tried to mess with you visibly and audibly before. And of course, the audacity, the nerve, for this game to feel like it stops, start back again, fade to black, but then put you back in the ring for a few more seconds of gameplay. Nothing will make you feel like you've traversed every sector of this particular heaven, more than playing and perfecting Remix 10 of Rhythm Heaven Fever. And with that, I'd like to show you this.
Alright. Oh no!
These were clips that were filmed all the way back in 2019. I invited my favorite cousin Gabby to hang out, and I was just about to finish yet another perfect run of Fever, and all I had left was Remix 10, and I wanted her to film and watch.
Oh! What? No!
Or 5.
No, it's take 5.
Yeah.
Go. Oh no! 7.
7
Don't worry.
of Remix 10.
Alright.
Let's do it. There were so many more failed attempts than what you're seeing here, but unlike any other time before and after that I've attempted to perfect Remix 10, even for this video, I hadn't felt as much of an adrenaline rush, a desire to do it right, than when you have a loved one next to you watching. Wait. Wait a minute. Whoa! And that moment was when it finally clicked to me what Rhythm Heaven Fever was really all about. Again, it's a shame that there isn't some indulgent post-game mode to tie all these pieces together, like what the previous games managed to do. Here in Fever, you get a couple of translated remasters of games from Tengoku, I guess to show how far the series has come from its roots, which was actually the catalyst for a lot of my thoughts and comparisons on the series. You also get some toys and endless arcade games, which, in a game that feels like it's always at 0 to 100, is a nice break room section, and the parts of the game that do remind me of the recreational vibe of the series on handhelds. In fact, I might even go as far as to say that the way these games use the Fever control scheme is slightly more interesting than the actual main minigames, simply by playing to its best strength of waiting patiently and timing something precisely, and by actually featuring mechanics that involve holding and releasing. Just that alone is enough to make me think about the controller I'm holding in a much more unique way than how I was already seeing it in the base campaign. But something I really didn't expect to floor me as much as it did was my journey through the 2-player mode. Of course, everything you're seeing here is done all by myself, unless I go several towns to grab a friend to help me emulate a Wii multiplayer game. But I remember playing this mode quite a bit as a kid, and I have a lot of fond memories sharing these games I already mastered with people who were less familiar with them. The minigames that are picked for multiplayer mode don't have anything too much different going on. It's the same game and inputs where occasionally you'll get one that asks player 1 to do something before player 2 and vice versa. But the big highlight for me were the endless minigames, where I actually tried playing them with 2 Wii remotes as a single player. Hey, I love Tui, okay? I'm used to going double duty when I'm gaming. But it turns out that playing the game like this did bring the gameplay something closer to a traditional control scheme with different buttons assigned to special roles. And I found myself having a really good time playing the game this way. Alternating between 2 characters or sides on the left and right with both my hands was a fun coordination challenge for games like Kung Fu Ball and Pirate Crew. I had rhythm in both hands, but I had to learn how to pass it on from one baton to the next. And going into the endless version of Bossa Nova, a game I already grew to love in single player, I had no qualms trying it out with a fuller control scheme, and sure enough, I had a blast. I felt like a drummer carrying 2 different rhythms in both hands and switching them up with style. Now obviously, these games were probably not meant to be played this way at all. You perhaps do need that personal push and pull from another person beside you trying to get the game working to get the most fun out of it. But as a fan of the earlier entries, I liked how viable this felt in single player, and it did manage to give me that spark of control potential that I wanted out of Fever all along. Seriously, if you feel like you've exhausted all the content from Fever after all of these years, give these multiplayer games a try for yourself if you want a fun alternative challenge from the base game. But outside of obligatory party modes, was there anything else that Rhythm Heaven could have taken advantage of in its transition from handheld to console? And it's hard to say. The structure of Fever is almost one-to-one exactly like the handheld games, even down to the forgiving barista mechanic. And it works out as good as it did back there. Maybe a more fleshed out campaign with extras beyond a back-to-back set of games would have helped the game stand out further from its origins, and a lot of the holes that this game and its campaign fall into for me personally mostly come down to the mindset that they chose when taking the game to a popular console and choosing not to use enough buttons. Because otherwise, Fever is exactly what you'd want, quality and content-wise, out of the next major entry in the series, and its inevitable debut to a home console. A cleaner view and sound of the Rhythm Heaven universe returning to a control scheme that would help it remain basically timeless for all of video game history. It's no wonder we're constantly seeing fan content about Fever to this day. It has the cleanest production and is home to some of the best and most divisive challenges in the entire series. I think if there's anything to take away from Fever and this video, it's that much like the concept of rhythm being so diverse and hard to compartmentalize into a single lesson or course, making a Rhythm Heaven game is much more involved than simply making the last game, but more and faster. This series was commissioned with the intention to get people on track with their relationship with natural rhythm, and to distinguish itself from the norms of its genre, but it also worked with Nintendo, so everything changes depending on how they're feeling that day. As the swan song to a legacy platform for 2D gaming and the bridge towards more interactive and intimate experiences on handhelds, Tengoku was an iteration of the original mission statement that was all about making the reality and normalcy of rhythm in our everyday lives as clear as day and as intuitive as possible, while also showing hints that there are stranger things and people out there who have more rhythms to share than even the strangest ones you just saw here. In the advent of touchscreen devices and international eyes, specifically as the pop music industry was starting to kick off, Rhythm Heaven on DS pivoted its initiative yet again to create an experience closer to learning an instrument for the first time, and selling lovable characters and the hint of more depth behind their performances and a connected universe, ingraining the series as a cultural phenomenon. And as the Wii was reaching the end of its era, with its original ambitions exhausted and a desire for more traditionally controlled, but thematically weirder and artsier games on home platforms, and after all the star power and quality Tsunku had poured into cartridges, came Rhythm Heaven Fever, a game that wanted to lecture more than ever about the fullest extent of rhythmic possibilities, and how those experiences, whether we've learned them to a T or still fail to understand them, can stick with us for a very long time. I think I made it pretty clear at this point that personally, I didn't like Fever as much as the previous game. It's a top-class music game of its own, and does deserve the spotlight it's retroactively given, but at large, it had to sacrifice a couple of nuances that prevented me from loving it as a Rhythm Heaven successor. It's the perfect example of what I think you risk doing when you base your sequel entirely on making it more challenging and provocative. You do get a memorable experience, but you also lose some of the coziness and warmth of being a project that didn't always need to prove itself difficulty-wise to make an impact. I do think it's possible for a sequel to put an emphasis on the core difficulty of the original gameplay, while also thinking about its cozier roots that help players warm up to that new paradigm you want them to graduate into. And Fever comes sorta close to doing that, with the same infectious bond and happiness that Heaven on DS successfully managed, but doesn't hold that flame for very long. But I think the most fascinating thing about Fever as a Rhythm Heaven game is how it attempts to future-proof the series, which, you could argue it did a poor job doing, as it's currently the last purely original Rhythm Heaven game up to now. But it did solidify a lot of things about the legacy of the series moving past its time. This wasn't a game with shiny 3D graphics, but some of the smoothest 2D visuals I had ever seen from a current platform at the time. An art style that would carry over vigorously to our current era of higher definition displays, with lower response times too. It's a game with many calls and shouts, one with a much stronger localization effort than the last, and one that could be controlled with pretty much anything you throw at it, even if it may not match the feasibility of the Wii Remote in its best moments. The easiness to pick up and play and remember this game is admirable. And I think that's why this entry gets so much overwhelming love outside of being wacky and hard as balls. It's the quality debut of a series that, despite being more than a decade old, feels like it should naturally exist in our current day and age. Now, if I were to talk about my ideal Rhythm Heaven sequel, you'd bet your coins with a smiley face on them that I'd want the quality levels of something like Fever, but I'd also like a return to focus on control innovations next time around. Now, am I saying that Fever needed motion controls to be good, or that we need some waggle or touchscreen gimmick for the next Rhythm Heaven game to be a reality? Absolutely not. But I do think there's some room to explore Rhythm Heaven as just a normal video game that you play with the extent of our everyday button and stick scheme. I find bringing this up funny because I had a similar pining for its sister series, which in the past I've similarly wanted a throwback and extension to a focus on button gameplay during the times when it would be contractually obligated to cope with Nintendo's next gimmick phases, and then years later it did end up giving me a new entry that delivered on exactly what I wanted and then some. So I suppose it's not too late for Rhythm Heaven to do the same thing on consoles anytime soon. Well, guys, it looks like we've all recovered from our Rhythm Heaven fever. So, now that we've covered Rhythm Heaven Fever and all of its unique successes and the reasons why it was made the way that it was and how I personally feel about it, I want to take some time to personally reflect on this entry in particular. And before you say anything, yes, I do know that there is one more entry in Rhythm Heaven after this. I'm not saying that this is the last entry in the series, that's not what I'm doing this for. But as I've said in the video earlier, Fever is technically, at least as of recording and uploading this video, the last wholly original Rhythm Heaven game. It's the first and probably the only console release that we have at this point for the franchise. It's often what people immediately think about when we think about how Rhythm Heaven looks like, and how it sounds like, and how the gameplay's supposed to go, but most importantly, it is the loudest and most confident Rhythm Heaven game ever made. And while I may have had my contentions with that label in regards to this series, it's still something really standout and special that isn't really manifested in something like Heaven on DS or Tengoku. And to put more perspective on that specialty, I've always pictured a deep dive into Fever being bookended with a personal story of mine. Now, this isn't going to be a story about how Rhythm Heaven changed my life or how it helped me during the lowest periods of my childhood or something. Not exactly that. The story I'm about to tell you is one where I was in high school, and by that point, these 3 games were already well worn under my belt. In fact, I might even say they were retro by that point. So it's not really a story about that. But it's more of a story about how the goodwill that these games were built under, and one that I did recognize, was something that finally hit me during a special moment in my life. And while the story does make me think of Rhythm Heaven as a whole, it does make me think more of Fever, and that's why I want to talk about it right now. But I guess for a bit of background, the Rhythm Heaven games were always a perfect gift for me growing up, because I was a very shy and introverted kid. I didn't have that many friends, and I didn't know how to make that many friends. And these games were like the perfect icebreakers, like prime show and tell material, because they were weird enough that not that many people knew about it, but it was accessible enough that I could be somebody who rationalized it and was there to show people what makes these games tick. I know I made a joke earlier about how I would shove my DS into my friends' faces with these rhythm games, but it wasn't really for bragging rights, because honestly, nobody else I knew played these games. I was the only one who owned these games, so who cares if I had like the biggest score in the world in them or something. It really didn't matter. But the real reason why I would show off these games all the time is because I really liked how playing well at these games technically gave you the best possible mixing of the music, you know what I mean? So I really liked being this kind of makeshift DJ that played the music of these games in front of people in like the coolest way possible. And that's why some of my most fond memories of these rhythm games is just showing them off to friends and letting them enjoy the music. But again, this story isn't really about the games, so let's rewind back to the beginning of high school for me. I felt very unconfident about myself. And the thing about being unconfident in yourself isn't that you're not smart or that you're stupid or anything, but you feel inconsistent. So like one day you'd be at the top of your game and you'd feel like you're getting all the right marks, you're getting everything ticked off perfectly, and then the next day you would completely fumble in who you were setting out to be, and what you wanted to accomplish that day. And it's because of that inconsistency and imbalance of how you perform on a day-to-day basis that you have this idea in your head that you're secretly a fraud on the inside, that any good moments that you did experience before were all completely flukes. And I'd like to believe that going through high school and coming out of it now did help me become a bit better and more confident in the end, because otherwise you wouldn't have this video, would you? But I distinctly remember my breaking point happening during a pivotal moment in my penultimate year before completely graduating from high school. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this for obvious reasons, but I'll sum it up to you guys as kinda, one of those typical high school cliches where you start to develop a really big crush on someone and you feel really happy about being around them, and then everybody in your friend group is coaxing you and hyping you up to ask them out before the year ends, and then you do it, and then they say no. And again, I'm not telling this story to garner any sympathy or to pin the blame on anybody. Nobody's really at fault for something like that, and it was handled as politely as possible, but I'm human, and I couldn't help but feel that after that, I was pretty bummed that things didn't work out, and then I started to cast a really big shadow of doubt about how things were gonna go for me afterwards. And so I remember for the rest of my high school year, I was just kind of spiraling into this sort of period where I wanted to be isolated and alone, and I'd take more time to just be with myself and my own thoughts. And then I vividly remember walking the empty halls after class when I bumped into one of my closest friends. And he told me that he was staying after school to practice for a tinikling performance. Tinikling is a Filipino folk dance that I'm going to put on screen right now. But yeah, he was preoccupied with that on some other side of the school. And I didn't know if he recognized how I was feeling at the time, but he just casually invited me to come hang with their practice. And then I was like, yeah, sure, I'm totally down. But I remember in the back of my head, and I didn't know if I said this out loud either at the time, but I remember thinking during that proposal that I was done with feeling left out, and I was done with feeling like I'm just kind of wasting away, and I wanted to cling on to something serious. So I said at the spur of the moment, yeah, sure, I'm down to watch. And then I hung out in their practice, and then I tried it out for myself. And then it just so happened that I ended up joining their team. I was the one who was clicking the sticks down, but it was still a role in their team out of nowhere. And I distinctly remember the in out pattern that we had to follow for the routine that we were doing. And I remember doing so many rehearsals just to do it for a school performance. I remember getting the chance to do it at other schools with them too. And this didn't really last very long, but it still sticks with me as a really important moment in my life, because it was just a very simple proposition that got me out of a very miserable phase that I was going through. And it was something as simple as keeping rhythm. It wasn't a complicated dance group or anything. I didn't have to sweat blood to be a part of their ranks or anything, but it was just a simple thing with friends. And it led to so many meetups and get-togethers and just really fun moments where I got to be on stage and got to do something cool. And it was a thing that I got involved with that finally gave me the assurance that I did have confidence in myself and that I could dedicate myself to something great, be a smaller part of something so much cooler. As a matter of fact, if you are watching this now, if you happened to be on that Nickling team and you just so happen to have reached this far into a 1-hour video game analysis on the internet, Well, I'd like to give you a very late thank you, because you may not have realized it, but you changed my life for the better. And I think at this point, you can see why I'm telling this story after Rhythm Heaven Fever, right? Because this is a moment where, when I think about it, I think of the Rhythm Heaven games. You know, I think about the weird circumstances of joining an ensemble or a group or some activity that's based in rhythm. I think about the weird sort of patterns that you have to memorize on cue. And most importantly, I think about the friends and the good times that came from doing something based in rhythm. And it's a moment in particular that really makes me think about the showmanship and confidence of an entry like Fever. And I think that's the best possible way that I can end this diatribe, right? I've gone into this critical discussion about how I feel about this game as a sequel, and yet it is still indicative to me of some of the most formative moments of my entire life. What can I say? Something remarkable about Fever, besides its quality and its challenge and whatnot, is that it isn't Tengoku 2 or Heaven on DS2. It proves to me that the most essential thing about Rhythm Heaven, besides its general mission statement about training people to learn about rhythm, is the time it chooses to release. Because every entry in this series has characterized learning rhythm in one unique way or another, from presenting it as a slice of life to a performative art, all the way to here as a confident get-together. And I've made it clear that I have my preferences between each of these motives, but ultimately, I'll always cherish how these games taught me in completely different ways how important a sense of rhythm is in your overall happiness and well-being. I don't play an instrument, I don't sing professionally, but you know what? I hum all the time. I recently tried learning how to whistle. I tap my feet, I bob my head whenever I catch a catchy tune. I don't mind doing dumb beatboxing from my mouth while I'm at work. I don't mind doing the most tedious, repetitive chore in the world while having an upbeat tempo in my head while doing it to make it go by in a snap. The point is, I found my confidence and my raison d'etre and my stability thanks to rhythm. And I sincerely hope that the next wholly original Rhythm Heaven game, whatever it may be, is able to be just as valid of a take on how important rhythm is in our everyday lives as what has come before.